stories of Quran, the stories of Quran, the stories of the glorious Quran, the stories of Quran, the stories of Quran, the stories of the glorious Quran.
Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Amma ba'd, fa'a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu alayka ya Rasulallah, wa ala alika wa ashabika ya Habiballah. Wassalatu wassalamu alayka ya Nabiyallah, wa ala alika wa ashabika ya Noorallah. Dear viewers of Madani Channel, once again, we bring another fresh episode before you of our program that goes by the name of Stories of Quran. In today's episode, we will be discussing about a very honored and distinguished Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who attained a very high and acclaimed rank in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This Prophet, alayhi salam, is specially known for the patience that he observed over the trials and tribulations that were inflicted upon him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many of us perhaps would already know that which prophet we will be discussing today, which prophet we will be talking about today, who remained steadfast upon all the tests and trials that were inflicted upon him, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also rewarded him immensely. It was none other than the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Hazrat Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wassalam. Today, insha'Allah, we will be briefly talking about the story of Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam. How was he afflicted with the trials and tribulations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how he remained steadfast, and how he was rewarded from the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and also what moral lessons do we derive from this story, what moral lessons can we derive from this story. We will cover all this insha'Allah after listening to the virtue of sending peace and salutations upon the noble Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. But Shaykh Tariqat Amir Ahl Sunnat, the founder of Dawat Islami, Hazrat Allama Maulana Abu Bilal Muhammad Ilyas Attar Qadari Razavi Ziyai Damat Barakatuhumul Aliyah, mentions again a very beautiful virtue and excellence of reciting Darood, sending peace and salutations upon the noble Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, in his beautiful booklet called Blessings of Salat and Salam. He mentions that the Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam stated that whoever recites Darood upon me once, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends 10 blessings upon him. So if we want to attain the blessings and mercies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we have been told a method for it in this beautiful hadith, that we need to recite Darood in the court of Holy Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam. Insha'Allah, this will be a means for the mercies and blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be showered upon us. So the more we can, the better it is. Try to recite as much Durood Pak as we can. Insha'Allah, we will see its benefits, its blessings in this world and in the hereafter. Sallu ala al-Habib sallallahu ta'ala ala Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Our topic of the day, Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam. Dear viewers of Madani Channel, Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam is one of those prophets who went through a lot of tests and trials, but he alayhi salatu wasalam remained steadfast on the right path. He remained steadfast on the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is amongst those prophets who attained a very distinguished, honored and elevated rank in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam, he is from the descendants of Sayyiduna Ishaq ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam, and his mother is from the descendants of Sayyiduna Lut ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam. So already we can see that how blessed he is, that what blessed lineage he has, that from one side his lineage goes all the way to Sayyiduna Ishaq alayhi salatu wasalam, and from the side of the mother it goes all the way up to Sayyiduna Lut ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala initially blessed Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam with a lot of bounties and blessings, including beauty, abundance of wealth and children, uncountable number of cattle, fields and gardens, you name it. And Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam had all those bounties and mercies from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to put Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam into tests and tribulations, then his home collapsed and his children, they became trapped under the debris of the house that was collapsed, and they all passed away, they all died. And all of the animals, including hundreds of camels and thousands of goats, they all died too. And all the crops and all the gardens that were under the possession of Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam, all of them also became ruined. All of a sudden, everything was taken away from Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam. Children are something a man loves immensely. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even took his children away from him. The house collapsed and they all became trapped under the debris of the house and they all passed away. So this is how the test and trial of Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam started. Now, in the end, Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam was left with nothing under his possession. And whenever he alayhi salatu wasalam was informed about this ruin and destruction of all his possessions, then he alayhi salatu wasalam would glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a very great lesson for us in these words which are coming up now, which Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam would mention whenever he would be reminded of the blessings that he had by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the ruin and all the calamities that befell upon him. Now what his reply would be to this, that he would glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and pay gratitude by saying, what was mine and what is mine? The one who is Lord of all has taken it. For the duration that he bestowed me with it, it was within my possession, and he Azza wa Jal has taken it back when he Almighty wished. I am always satisfied in whatever pleases him. So these are the beautiful words in which Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam would glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon whenever someone would make him remember the prosperity that he was enjoying at once, and now the trials and tribulations he was facing. So this is how beautifully he would reply to them. So after all this was taken away from him, all the cattle, all the wealth, all his children, all his properties, everything is taken away from him. Now he alayhi salatu wasalam was inflicted with an illness, with a disease, and it is stated that so big sized blisters, they covered the blessed body of Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam. Now under this state, everyone left him. Everyone left Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam except for his only wife. So no one remained with Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam. It was only his wife who stayed with him, and her name was Rahma binte Ephraim. Now, she was also that sacred individual who remained with Sayyidina Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam and served him, and she was also from a very noble lineage. She was also from a very distinguished and honored lineage. She was the granddaughter of Sayyiduna Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam. So we can see that what great lineages did both these great distinguished individuals, Sayyidina Ayub alayhi salam and Sayyidatuna Rahma binte Ephraim radiyallahu ta'ala anha, they both belonged to. So Sayyidina Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam belonged to Sayyidina Ishaq alayhi salatu wasalam and Sayyidina Lut alayhi salatu wasalam's lineage, and Sayyidatuna Rahma binte Ephraim rahmatullahi ta'ala alayha belonged to the lineage of Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam. Now when Sayyidina Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam had fallen ill and everyone had left him, now it was only his wife rahmatullahi ta'ala alayha who used to serve him immensely, who would serve him day and night. Now Sayyidina Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam suffered this very state for many years, and he alayhi salatu wasalam remained in severe pains due to the blisters and boils. Now, dear viewers of Madani Channel, over here, there is a widespread misconception amongst people where they think that Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam was ma'adallah suffering from vitiligo. It is a disease in which white spots, they emerge on the skin. So many people, they have this misconception that ma'adallah Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam was suffering from this very disease. And some unauthentic books have also recorded fabricated stories of leprosy, that ma'adallah Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam was facing leprosy, ma'adallah. But remember that these stories and these tales are completely incorrect and fabricated ones, as Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam or any other prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has never been afflicted with leprosy. It has never been that any prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala faced the illness of leprosy. Now, in this context, there is a unanimous opinion and consensus of all the ulama that the Anbiya, the Prophets alayhimus salatu wasalam, they are protected from all such kind of diseases which are considered to be detested and a means of disgrace by the ordinary people, because the sole responsibility and obligation of Anbiya Kiram alayhimus salatu wasalam is to convey the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the people. It is to propagate the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the people. Now, if they are ma'adallah afflicted with any such kind of illness which is considered to be disgraceful by the people, then people will run far away from them. Then how would they become successful in their obligation and the purpose for which they have been sent towards the people to with? So if their sole purpose and obligation is to propagate the message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it is obvious that they need to be protected from all such kind of diseases which would make people run away from them, which people would consider to be disgraceful. So Anbiya Kiram alayhimus salatu wasalam, all of them, they were protected from any such kind of illnesses and diseases that were considered to be disgraceful by the people. So based on the same principle, same ruling, Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam was also protected from leprosy, which is obviously a disease which people consider to be disgraceful. So all prophets, they were free from such kind of diseases so that they could execute their obligation which they have been sent with by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we need to clear our minds that Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam was ma'azallah afflicted with the disease called vitiligo or leprosy or any such kind of disease. It was only that his blessed body has blisters, boils and some pimples, due to which he alayhi salatu wasalam suffered a lot of pain and trouble for many years. But he alayhi salatu wasalam endured it all with great patience and gratefulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then, with the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam made this following dua in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which has been mentioned in Surah Anbiya, verse number 83. And translation from Kanzul Iman is that distress has afflicted me, and you are the most merciful of all those who do mercy. So these are the words in which Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam presented his plea in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam remained steadfast in the trial and the tests that were afflicted upon him by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he was successful in the trial and the tests that he faced from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then his supplication, the dua which he made in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, was also accepted. Now, how his dua was accepted? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded him that, O Ayub, stamp your foot on the ground. So Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam, he stamped his blessed foot on the ground, and immediately a spring of water gushed forth. A spring of water emerged as soon as Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam stamped his foot on the ground upon the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam to take bath from the water of this very spring. Therefore, Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam took a bath from that water, and all his blessed body, the apparent body, everything healed up. Now he alayhi salatu wasalam walked 40 steps, and he was commanded again to stamp the ground again. So as soon as Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam stamped his foot on the ground, another spring of water, it emerged, and its water was very cold, sweet, and exceptionally delicious. So when Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam drank the water of this very spring, his inner self was enlightened with the divine light, and he alayhi salatu wasalam attained excellent health and a very high level of spirituality. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala resurrected all his children back. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revived all the children back of Sayyidina Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam and blessed his wife with youth again. After that, he alayhi salatu wasalam was also blessed again with the lost riches and cattle, provisions and resources. In fact, he alayhi salatu wasalam was blessed with more wealth and more possessions, more properties than what he initially possessed. So because of his gratitude and thankfulness in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only returned back what was taken away from him, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with even more than what he initially possessed. So this is how the beautiful incident of Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam has been mentioned in the Holy Quran, and how he alayhi salatu wasalam recovered from his illness, and how he alayhi salatu wasalam was blessed again with all the bounties and all the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had initially blessed him with, and took it back at one stage. But after he alayhi salatu wasalam observed patience upon the tests and tribulations, he alayhi salatu wasalam was blessed with all that, in fact with a lot more from the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now all this incident has been beautifully mentioned in the Holy Quran in verses 42 to 44 of Surah Sad in the following words. Translation from Kanzul Iman is: We said to him, strike the earth with your foot. This cool spring is for bathing and drinking. And we bestowed his family upon him, and more similar to it in number, as mercy from us, and advice for the people of intellect. And we said, take a broom in your hand and strike her with it, since you took oath to strike your wife with 100 lashes, and do not break your oath. We indeed found him patient. What an excellent bondsman. He is indeed ever repenting to his Lord. So Sayyiduna Ayub alayhi salatu wasalam was fully successful in his trial. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with all types of bounties, and the Holy Quran crowned his blessed head by presenting him with the unparalleled title of Awwab. So because of all the tests and tribulations that he went through, and he bore patience upon all of them, the Holy Quran also remembers him with the title of Awwab. So this was the title given to him because of all his patience and everything that he went through. So dear viewers of Madani Channel, what do we learn from this beautiful and exciting story of the Holy Quran? We learn that the chosen people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are also tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They are also made to face the tribulations from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, the more closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala you are, the greater and stronger tests you will have to face. And we also come to know that once you face the tests and trials from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we shall always observe patience, no matter how severe the tests and tribulations are, no matter how severe the times are upon us. We shall never deviate away from the right path. And as a result of this, once we remain steadfast upon the right path, when all the tests and tribulations they befall upon us, when we remain steadfast upon the right path, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He blesses us immensely in this world, and also will bless us immensely in the hereafter as well. Whether it is in the form of offspring, whether it is in the form of wealth, whether it is in the form of properties, whatever it is, whenever we are tested in whichever way from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we shall never ever be impatient. Because unfortunately nowadays, whenever calamities befall upon us, we start being impatient and ma'adallah mourning to, and sometimes ma'adallah utter such sentences which even take a person out of the folds of Islam. Whereas if we remain patient upon the calamities that befall upon us, if we remain patient upon them, and if we glorify Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in every state, then we can attain great rewards. We can attain great reward from the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that will become a means of elevation of our ranks in this world and in the hereafter. And there would be many other bounties and blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that would be showered upon us. So by being impatient and by openly mourning over it, we close the doors of mercies and blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we could be deserving by staying patient upon all those calamities. So from this beautiful event of Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam, we learn that the more testing times one faces, that the more closer one is in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more testing times and trials he'll have to face. And the more patience one observes upon facing those tests and trials from the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more closer he would get in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the more deserving he would be of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more deserving he would be of attaining the highly elevated ranks in the court of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So never ever shall we be impatient upon facing any kind of calamities, or upon facing any kind of tests and trials from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But on the other hand, we should realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala only tests His chosen people. So if we are being tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it can be a case of us being chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It can be a case of us having our ranks elevated by observing patience. So whatever trial or test we have to face, always remain patient upon them, always keep glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and always try to remain content upon the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Insha'Allah azza wa jal, this will elevate our ranks in this world and in the hereafter, and also it will make us deserving of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from such means which will even be beyond our comprehension, our perception. May Allah Almighty enable us to observe patience for the sake of Sayyiduna Ayub ala nabiyyina wa alayhi salatu wasalam, and may Allah Almighty enable us to stay away from being impatient in case we are tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in case any calamity befalls upon us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ameen. Bijahin Nabiyyil Ameen sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Sallu ala al-Habib sallallahu ta'ala ala Muhammad sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa alihi wa sallam.
The stories of Quran, the stories of Quran, the stories of the glorious Quran. The stories of Quran, the stories of Quran, the stories of the glorious Quran.